She had been in Japan for less than 3 months, 22 years old, a biology graduate from a small village in Warwickshire, England, teaching English to adults in Tokyo, saving up for a world tour with her boyfriend. By any measure, Lindsay Hawker had done everything right. She was reported missing on a Monday morning when she didn't show up for work. By that same evening, police knew exactly where she had been, and they had already let the man responsible walk out the door. Tatsuya Ichihashi was on the run for 2.5 years. He performed surgery on his own face to avoid recognition. He became a best-selling author before his trial even started. And when it was all over, a Japanese court decided he did not deserve to die for what he had done. This is the story of Lindsay Hawker and the slow-motion failure that kept her killer free far longer than he should have been. Lindsay Ann Hawker was born in 1984 and grew up in Brandon, a small village near Coventry in Warwickshire, England. By all accounts, she was the kind of person people remember warmly. Bright, enthusiastic, full of plans. She earned a biology degree, and she and her boyfriend, Ryan Garside, had mapped out an ambitious goal: work, save, then travel the world together. Japan was the first stop. In early 2007, Lindsay arrived in Tokyo to take up a position at Nova, Japan's largest chain of private English conversation schools. She was 22 years old. She lived in a company apartment near Nishi Funabashi Station in Chiba Prefecture, taught her classes, went to cafes, explored the city. She was, by all accounts, genuinely happy. Then, sometime around midnight on the 20th of March, a man followed her home. His name was Tatsuya Ichihashi. He was 28 years old, unemployed, and living off a monthly allowance from his parents in a small apartment in the nearby city of Ichikawa. He had spotted Lindsay on the Tozai Line train, run after her as she cycled home from the station, and asked her, right there in the street, if she would give him private English lessons. Lindsay was a teacher. The request wasn't completely unusual. She exchanged email addresses with him. Over the next few days, they traded a few messages. She agreed to meet him on Sunday, the 25th of March, for an English lesson at a cafe. What happened after that is known in outline. They met at the cafe. At some point, the arrangement shifted. They got into a taxi together and rode to Ichihashi's apartment, only a few hundred meters away. Before going inside, Lindsay told the driver to wait. She would only be a few minutes. 7 minutes later, the driver gave up and left. She never came back out. Nova reported Lindsay missing at 2:30 in the afternoon on Monday, the 26th of March, after she failed to show up for 2 consecutive days of classes. 2 police officers were dispatched to look into it. They located Ichihashi's apartment and arrived at 5:40 that evening. Under Japanese law at the time, officers could not knock and demand entry without sufficient cause. They waited outside, and while they waited, Tatsuya Ichihashi stepped out of the building and fled, barefoot, right past them. Later that night, police obtained the authority they needed. They searched the apartment. On the balcony, half buried in a bathtub filled with a mixture of sand and compost soil, was Lindsay's naked body. Her wrists and ankles had been bound with plastic ties. She had been gagged with scarves. One of her hands was still above the surface of the dirt. She had not been taken far, she had not been hidden well, and the man responsible had been standing within arm's reach of the police for most of the evening. The failure to detain Ichihashi at his apartment was later described as a catastrophic procedural breakdown. Officers had a missing British woman and a named person of interest, but without a formal warrant or sufficient cause for arrest on the spot, they were legally constrained from entering. It's said that some officers hesitated, uncertain whether forcing the issue would be an overreach. Whatever the precise reasoning, the result was that Japan's most wanted fugitive walked away in bare feet and disappeared into a city of millions. What followed was one of the longest and most unusual manhunts in recent Japanese criminal history. In the weeks after his escape, Ichihashi drifted across the country. He took odd jobs, restaurant work, labor on a fishing boat, and paid for everything in cash to avoid any traceable trail. He grew his hair and changed his clothing, but he concluded that surface disguise was not enough. His face was on wanted posters across Japan. The photograph used in those posters was, crucially, 7 years out of date, but it was recognizable enough to make him nervous. So Ichihashi decided to change his face. In his own account, published later, he described performing surgery on himself with minimal tools. He bound his nose with a needle and thread to narrow its shape. He took a box cutter and excised 2 moles from his cheek, distinctive marks that appeared in the wanted photograph. He attempted to slice off part of his lower lip to make it thinner, had to stop because of the pain, and then returned to finish the procedure a few days later. Eventually, he sought out 2 professional plastic surgery operations, one to lengthen his nose and another to raise the bridge. The self-surgery was not performed in sterile conditions. There was no anesthesia. By any measure, it was an extreme act, either of desperation or of cold-blooded calculation, depending on how you read him. In the book, Ichihashi described all of this matter-of-factly, as if documenting a practical problem he had needed to solve. He spent portions of his fugitive years on a remote island off Japan's coast, fishing, keeping a low profile. For 2 years and 7 months, no one caught him. The end came on the 10th of November 2009 at a ferry terminal in Osaka. Ichihashi had planned to board a ferry to Okinawa, a further retreat. A port worker glanced at the queue, recognized him despite the altered face, and alerted security. Police moved in moments before Ichihashi reached the gangway. When officers confronted him, he gave his name without hesitation. "Yes, I am Tatsuya Ichihashi." He was initially arrested on a charge of abandoning a corpse. Warrants for rape and murder followed. No fully satisfying explanation of Ichihashi's motive emerged from the investigation or the trial. He described the events in his book, published before his trial even began, in a way that focused almost entirely on his own experience as a fugitive rather than on what he had done to Lindsay or why. He framed the book as an act of contrition. The Hawker family called it disgusting. In court, Ichihashi admitted to killing Lindsay Hawker. He stated that when she was about to scream, he smothered her to suppress the sound, and in doing so, caused her death. He did not elaborate on what had preceded that moment. What is known about his background: he came from an educated, professional family. His mother was a dentist. His father was a medical doctor. He had graduated from Chiba University with a degree in horticulture. He did not seek employment after graduation. He received a monthly allowance from his parents of roughly 100,000 yen, approximately $750 at the time. By 28 years old, he had no career, no apparent ambitions, and no visible social life beyond his parents' financial support. There was a prior incident on his record. It is alleged, though it was settled out of court and never resulted in a conviction, that approximately 6 years before Lindsay's murder, Ichihashi had assaulted a man during a street robbery. Whether this represents a pattern of escalating predatory behavior or an isolated incident is not confirmed. But it exists. What is clear from the sequence of events is that Ichihashi had been watching Lindsay for at least a week before he approached her. He followed her home from the station after midnight. He presented himself as polite, harmless, seeking language help. The approach was targeted rather than impulsive. He had her email address. He arranged a meeting. He knew exactly where she lived. Note: what follows is interpretive commentary, not a clinical diagnosis. What the evidence suggests is a man who combined a surface of compliance, a quiet, educated manner, a reputable family background, a university degree, with an extraordinary capacity for detachment from consequences. Those who commented on the case from a psychological perspective described Ichihashi as exhibiting traits often associated with psychopathy: diminished empathy, the ability to appear charming or harmless to achieve a goal, and a striking absence of genuine accountability. He offered the Hawker family royalties from his book, describing this as contrition. He framed the book itself, written while awaiting trial for her murder, as part of the same contrition. The family rejected both the royalties and the framing. The fugitive years reveal something too. The self-surgery, cutting off his own moles with a box cutter, binding his nose with thread, slicing his lip in stages because the pain was too much to finish in one sitting, was not the behavior of someone in blind panic. It was methodical, patient. The behavior of someone willing to absorb significant personal cost in service of a long-term strategic objective. Those qualities do not emerge from nowhere. The years of unemployment, the parental allowance, the apparent absence of any drive toward ordinary goals. It is possible to read these not simply as failure, but as a kind of detachment from the ordinary systems of obligation and accountability that structure most people's lives. When you are not answerable to anyone for the basic rhythms of your days, it may be easier to treat other people as similarly unaccountable to you. None of this explains what happened. It contextualizes it, which is not the same thing. And the Hawker family was clear throughout every stage of the process that understanding and justice were not interchangeable. Lindsay Hawker had done everything right. She had a plan, she had people who loved her, and she was exactly where she wanted to be at 22. Doing work she cared about in a city she was beginning to know. None of that was enough to protect her. Her killer was caught. He is serving a life sentence in a Japanese prison. In a formal sense, that is justice. But the case also laid bare how many points a system can fail. The warrant constraint, the hesitation at the door, the wanted photograph that was 7 years old, 2.5 years before anyone stopped him at a ferry port, a book published and sold before a trial, a court ultimately deciding that the man who smothered a young woman to silence her still had enough redeemable humanity to keep his life. Lindsay's family, her parents Bill and Julia, her sisters Lisa and Louise, traveled to Japan repeatedly in the years after her death. They attended hearings. They spoke to the press. They refused to let her become simply a case number. Her mother wiped tears from her face when the life sentence was announced in July 2011. Her father had asked the court for no mercy. The case had some downstream effects. Japan's police procedures around emergency search authority and missing persons responses faced renewed public scrutiny. The Ichihashi trial was also one of the early high-profile cases conducted under Japan's new lay judge system, Saibanin Seido, in which ordinary citizens sit alongside professional judges in serious criminal proceedings, a reform introduced specifically to bring more transparency and public accountability into a judicial process that had long been criticized as too opaque. But the photograph on the wanted poster was still 7 years old, and Tatsuya Ichihashi fished off a remote island for 2.5 years while Lindsay's family waited. If you've been with us through this story, thank you. These cases are genuinely hard to sit with, and they're supposed to be. That discomfort is part of what stops us from looking away, and looking away is not something Lindsay's memory deserves. If you want to hear more stories told this carefully, the subscribe button is right there. We'll keep going. See you in the next one.